Next, let's talk about Amazon Personalize. Word on the street is this is getting more and more attention on the exam, so let's go into a fair amount of depth on this one. What is Amazon Personalized? It's a fully managed recommendation engine. So if you've ever been to Amazon and see recommended items for you, or people who bought this also bought, or similar items to what you're looking at, that's all coming from recommendation engines, where they're looking at your past behavior, the things that you've expressed interest in the past, like what you've purchased, what you've added to your cart, what you've looked at, and they're surfacing items that are similar to the stuff that you like, and these are your recommendations at a very high level. They claim it's the same engine that Amazon uses. I'm skeptical of that, but certainly some of the technology is in common. The way it works is it's primarily used through an API. So basically, Amazon Personalize is this big black box where you feed in data about what customers like, and it gives you back recommendations for those customers. And of course, there's more to it than that, but at a high level, that's the idea. So you need to feed it in data that indicates interest from your users. And when you're going to be doing this for the first time, you need to bootstrap this, right? You're going to need to play back logs of historical data about what your users purchased, what they rated, what they looked at. They call that impressions in the terminology of Personalize. What they added to their cart, information about the catalog. It can actually take advantage of item descriptions of the items in your catalog. And you can also give it things like user demographics. What are the ages and any other information that you might have about your users that might be relevant to what they're interested in. And there's a couple of ways to feed this data in. One is you can just throw it into S3 and give Amazon Personalize a schema for that, and it will ingest it and monitor S3 for that data. And this is very useful if you're doing a big batch operation, right? If you're doing that initial bootstrapping. But for real-time recommendations, you might want to do that through their API instead. So primarily, again, Amazon Personalized is used through an API where you might just say, hey, Amazon Personalized, this user just bought this thing. You should use that to make better recommendations for them going forward. Whatever data you provide, you need to provide an explicit schema for that data. So you do that in Avro format in Amazon Personalize. So if you're sending it a data full of user ratings or catalog information, you got to tell it what's what and tell it what each column corresponds to. And sometimes those things will be things that it can explicitly take advantage of in its internal algorithms. You can either do this through JavaScript or through the SDK itself. So if you're doing this from a website, you could just have a little snippet of JavaScript that said, hey, this person bought this thing or this person looked at this thing, and send that straight into Amazon Personalized from their web browser, or there's SDK access for doing this offline. The two main APIs are Get Recommendations and Get Personalized Ranking. So Get Recommendations does what it sounds like. It retrieves recommended products or content or whatever it is that you're trying to push for a given user. So you give it a user and it says, these are the things I think that user would like. And we'll get into the details of that shortly. You can also tell it to just give you similar items. So this is useful if you're presenting one item to a person at large. Maybe you don't even know who that person is, but a good recommendation would be items that are similar to the things that person is looking at right now. So even if I don't know who the user is, if I know they're looking at a given book, I can recommend books that are similar to that book based on the aggregate customer behavior of all the other customers. The other API is Get Personalized Ranking, and this just gives you a ranking of a list of items that you provide. So this is a use case where you don't really want to give people their actual recommendations. You have some ulterior motive where you want to push specific products. And maybe the only personalization you want is ranking that list of items to the things that are most relevant to the person looking at it. So if you have a list of things that you really want to sell right now, Get Personalized Ranking can be used to order that list for each individual and try to drive its conversion in the best way. So if you need that really low-level editorial control or curation about what is being recommended, you can at least rank those items in an intelligent way for each user. And there is console access and command line interface access as well. So for experimentation, you might do that. But again, in the real world, you'll probably be interacting with this through S3 or through the API. Let's talk about some features. Before I do, a little graphic here of how it works conceptually again. So again, we have an SDK that's sending us events, or that might be coming through JavaScript from web pages. And Amazon Personalize is just this big black box that you feed it events, and it gives you recommendations. And that event data might also come from S3. So that's really all there is to think about it from a conceptual standpoint. But let's get into its features more deeply. So like I said, you can do real-time or batch recommendations. So if I can actually hit this service through the SDK and say in real time, I want real-time recommendations for this user based on all the information you have about that user up to this point. Or I can also use the SDK to get back batch recommendations. So I could say, hey, Personalize, here's a whole pile of customer behavior data. I want to get a whole pile of recommendations back for a whole pile of users all at once. Either way, you can do it. It also allows you to make recommendations for new users that you haven't seen before. We call this the cold start problem. A common problem in recommender systems in general is, what do you do when you don't know anything about a person yet? Well, in the case of Amazon Personalize, it just recommends popular items if it doesn't know anything else about that person. And for new items, well, new items aren't new for long. So as soon as somebody buys something, they'll start to have relationships to other items in your catalog. And to that end, they actually recompute those similarities every 2 hours. So new items don't stay new for long. It can also provide what we call contextual recommendations. So if you have recommendations that might vary based on the device type that is being viewed on, or the time of day, or whatever else you can imagine, you can have recommendations that take that context into account. So in addition to the user, you might provide additional information like, am I looking at this on a phone? Am I looking at this on a laptop? What time of day is it? Where am I? And that context might even provide better recommendations. Of course, you need to have really rich data, a lot of data for that to work well, but the ability is there for you. And like I said, it can also just provide similar items. So if you're just trying to build people who bought this also bought on your own website, you can use the Similar Items API for doing that. Also, it has the ability to take unstructured text and make sense of it, which is a really nice feature. So if you do have sparse data, if you don't have enough customer behavior data or purchases or impressions to really make good recommendations, you can still give it catalog data. So the item descriptions can actually be mined, and we can make recommendations just based on the similarities between items based on their descriptions and the items themselves. Okay. Some terminology here that you might see on the exam. So there are various components to Amazon Personalize under the hood. One is what they call data sets, and that can consist of your user data. And again, that might include data, not just the user ID, but information about those users, their age, their where they live, their gender, whatever you want to do. Again, there are ethical concerns here about what you actually based your recommendations on, so tread carefully there. Also item data, and again, that can include information about the items and not just the item IDs. And finally, interactions, which are people interacting with your items or users interacting with your items in some way that indicates interest. Maybe it's a cart ad, maybe it's buying something, maybe it's looking at something, maybe it's rating something. All those interactions would be in your interactions data set. It also has a concept of recipes. So the recipe is basically, what kind of model do I want to build with Amazon Personalize? One is user personalization, meaning that I want to get recommendations for a specific user. The other is personalized ranking, meaning that I'm giving it a list of items that I want you to rank in a personal manner. And finally, related items is the other recipe, the one where we're just getting similar items for a given item based on aggregate customer behavior. So user personalization, give me recommendations for this user. Personalized ranking, rank this list of items for this user. Related items, I don't know who the user is, but I know what they're looking at. Give me similar items to that item. Another concept is what we call solutions. So think of this as the model that's under the hood in Amazon Personalize. The solution is responsible for actually training the model given the data that you provided to it. And while you're at it, there's a bunch of things you can do. You can actually tell it to optimize not only for relevance, but as well as additional objectives that you might have. So if you, I have strong feelings about this, guys, but I guess some people really want to do this. So if you really want to optimize price, for example, let's say you want to give a boost to items that are expensive so you can make more money. Maybe I might say, I don't only care about relevance, I also care about price. So high ticket items I want to give a little bit of a boost to. Or maybe I'm recommending videos, and my objective is to get people to watch more videos and spend more time on my service. In that case, maybe video length would be an additional objective that I give the system to optimize for. So relevance is always a piece of it, but you can tell it I also want to optimize for other things, and you can control how much that counts. So as long as it's some numeric field, it doesn't matter what it is, you can introduce that as an additional objective to Amazon Personalize in addition to personal relevance. It can also do automatic hyperparameter optimization, and we'll talk about those hyperparameters in much more depth shortly. But under the hood, it can actually find some of the best parameters for the underlying models to get the optimal results for you without you having to think about it too much. And it has the concept of campaigns. So this is the operations side of it all. A campaign is what deploys your solution version. That's a model that's been trained with a given set of data. And it will also deploy the capacity for generating those real-time recommendations. So it's going to create those endpoints for your application to hit through the SDK or through a JavaScript to actually retrieve recommendations back in real time. So Amazon Personalize really is this big self-contained black box where you feed it data and it creates under the hood a fleet of servers that you can hit to actually get recommendations back from it. You don't have to worry about it all. It's all fully managed for you. Talking about hyperparameters, so there are a bunch of knobs and dials, and these sorts of details are the sorts of things that the certification exam likes to bring up from time to time. These are really the only details that you have to think about with Amazon Personalize, so probably good to know what they are. We talked about hyperparameter optimization, HPO. And for both the user personalization and personalized ranking recipes, hidden dimension is something that will be automatically optimized for you. So that's just how many hidden variables are there in the underlying model. And obviously that's going to vary based on your data set and what you're trying to do, so it will optimize that for you automatically. There's also something you can set called BPTT, backpropagation through time. So if you want time to play a factor in your recommendation results, you might want to turn that on. Under the hood, that creates a recurrent neural network, an RNN, where basically the older an event is, the less it counts, right? So if I want to give more of a weight to recent things, BPTT is one way of doing that, but another way of doing that is recency mask, which just explicitly weights recent events more. So BPTT is, doing an RNN. It's actually taking time into account within the underlying neural network. Recency mask is a little bit more of a simple approach where it just gives more of a weight to recent events, and that works too. Also, there's something called min and max user history length percentile. What does that mean? So one problem that you see in practice with recommender systems is that your data is not clean. So if you have a bunch of impression data coming in from your website, robots or crawlers are going to really mess up your results, right? You're going to get these crawlers that are just looking at everything on your website, and your recommendation algorithms will have a hard time of making sense of that. Or maybe you have big institutional buyers where one person is buying everything for a huge company and they don't really represent the individual interests of a given person. Again, those sorts of users can really mess up your results. So you can say, I want to throw out this percentile of user history length. So if I have a user that has, a billion things they've looked at, well, that's ridiculous. Let's say 1,000 things they've looked at. Maybe I want to throw that out because that's going to be in a upper percentile of user history length. And similarly, I can also enforce a minimum boundary on that. So I can say, I also don't want to pay attention to people who only looked at one thing or two things. Maybe that's just not enough information to give me meaningful results. So that's another thing you can fiddle with. But generally, you would set the max user history length percentile to try to filter out those robots and crawlers and institutional buyers. And min is sort of a minimal quality threshold there. Another dial you can turn is exploration weight. It goes from 0 to 1. I think it's 0.3 by default. And it basically controls the relevance of your results. Why would you ever want less relevance? Well, if you're not getting enough results, you might want to turn that down a little bit in order to get more results. So if you're too picky, you might not get any recommendations at all for a person, or you just might get one or two. So if you want to show things to fill out some space in a list of recommendations, you might need to play with exploration weight to cast a wider net, if you will, on what recommendations you're returning. Also, there's exploration item age cutoff, and that just sets how far back in time you go while you're doing that exploration. So if I don't want to pay attention to events beyond a certain date, I can set an age cutoff and say, hey, if someone looked at something 5 years ago, probably not that relevant to their current interest. And maybe I can safely throw that away and therefore speed up the processing of this data as well. And for the similar items recipe, there's a couple more. So there's item ID hidden dimension, just like the hidden dimension on user personalization and personalized ranking, that is automatically optimized for you. Also optimized for you is item metadata hidden dimension, and that's for the model of making sense of the metadata that you provided for the items, the descriptions and whatnot. Again, that is automatically optimized for you as well with HPO, although you do need to provide it with a minimum and maximum range to work with. How do I maintain my Amazon personalization system? Well, you want to keep your data sets current. So you want to make sure that you're doing incremental data imports frequently. So as more user behavior comes in, if I'm doing this in a batch manner, I want to make sure that I'm always feeding it the latest and greatest data that I have. So make sure you're doing those incremental data imports to keep your results up to date. And if you want to do that in real time, there's a put events API call you can do. And so in real time, I could say, hey, this person looked at this thing and they liked it, put event, and that will maintain the relevance of my model or my solution, if you will, right away. It will actually incrementally improve that using that new data in real time. Now, every so often you do need to retrain the entire model, and they call this a new solution version. So every 2 hours by default, it will retrain your model for you with all the latest and greatest data. But you still want to do a full retrain at least weekly. So the incremental retraining based on new data is good enough for a while, but you really want to retrain the entire thing once in a while to get the best results. So AWS's recommendation is to do a full retrain weekly, and you do that by just setting the training mode parameter to full when you do that. Let's talk about security briefly with Amazon Personalize. One important point is that data is not shared across accounts. So this is a big concern when you have a company like AWS doing personalization. It would be really tempting for them to pool everyone's data together to get even better results, right? I think I actually wrote a patent on that when I worked at Amazon myself. But the idea there would be, wouldn't it be cool if I could pool together all the user behavior data across many websites and let them all benefit from that additional data and make better recommendations? Well, it sounds great, but there's all sorts of privacy concerns associated with that. So especially with things like GDPR, you just can't take somebody's behavior on one website and share it with another website, even indirectly like that. So they do not do that. Data is not shared across AWS accounts. The data that you're sending can be encrypted with KMS if you want. No big surprise there. And you can also encrypt it at rest if you're putting that in S3. Just SSC S3 would be the encryption that would be used to encrypt that data within S3 that you're providing. That's fine. And internally, data does need to be moved around between your account and Amazon's internal servers that are actually processing this data for you. That data is encrypted in transit with TLS 1.2 automatically. Access control to the service is done through IAM, like everything else is. And also, a little gotcha here operationally, you do need to make sure that your data that you're feeding to it in S3 has the appropriate bucket policy for Amazon Personalize to process it. So if you have a situation where Amazon Personalize can't seem to get that training data, that event data from S3, it's probably because the appropriate bucket policy was not set. I can see that being a question maybe on the exam. Also, like with everything else, monitoring and logging is done through CloudWatch and CloudTrail. No big surprise there. Pricing. So you pay for everything you do with Amazon Personalize. Again, it's fully managed, so you're not going to be paying for the actual servers, but you pay for what those servers are doing. So for data ingestion, for feeding it event data, you pay by the gigabyte. For the training, you pay per training hour, so how many instance hours are taken training the model, and that can add up for a large model. For inference, for actually providing the recommendations in real time, you are charged per TPS hour. That's transactions per second averaged over each hour. So the more you're hitting the service to get recommendations from it, the more they will charge you. And for batch recommendations, if you're not doing it in real time, they charge you per user or per item. So if I use the batch API to get recommendations for a bunch of users or a bunch of similar items for a bunch of items, I'm charged by how many users or how many items I actually asked for. So that is Amazon Personalize in a nutshell. It is, like I said, a fully managed service, and as such, there's not a whole lot you have to know about it or think about with it. But those are all the details I could find that might crop up on the exam.